Hi, this is Doug Brown from Mountainside Church of Christ. I'm bringing you episode 3 in the Mountainside Apologetics series called the Teleological Argument. Just to let you know my background, I have a master's in computer science from Purdue University and a bachelor's in engineering science from Florida State University. Physics was one of my favorite classes when I was in undergraduate school, and so I've always had an interest in science, an interest in the Bible, an interest in understanding how God created this universe, and wanted to present some arguments today. The teleological argument is an argument based upon design. It's an argument that says there is evidence of design in nature. There's order, there's beauty, there's elegance, and there appears to be a purpose in the design of this world and universe. And so because there is evidence of design, we believe that that implies the existence of an intelligent designer with certain qualities. And that designer would have tremendous knowledge and understanding. He would have a purpose behind the design. He had the foresight to create this world and the wisdom and intention to do so. So the argument is that because there is evidence of design, that implies the existence of a designer. Evan talked about that in the last lesson in the Apologetics series. Well, the Bible itself makes an argument for design. In Psalm chapter 19, verses 1 through 4, David wrote, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words, whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." If you've ever spent some time gazing at the stars at night, you know what David's talking about. There's a great beauty in the heavens, and if you have the advantage of being able to look at the stars and the galaxies through telescopes, especially the Hubble telescope pictures, which are extremely accurate, it's even more impressive and very beautiful. Well, the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 1:20, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." He simply says that the evidence around us in nature is enough to tell us that there is a creator and that we have no excuse for not recognizing that. Well, let's look at the next slide. It shows two objects, a jet fighter plane and a bird, probably a seagull. The question is, are these objects designed? Well, we look at the jet fighter, we know it's designed. We know that mankind designed and built these impressive machines. And yet, if you think about it, the bird next to it is equally impressive, maybe more so. The bird is able to fly. The bird is able to land. It doesn't even need wheels or a landing strip. The bird has its own energy producing system. It eats fish or whatever, digests them, produces energy, and is able to fly. It has its own self-contained guidance system, so it can decide where it wants to go and see and go there. So why is it that we don't apply the same criteria and reasoning to things in nature that we do to man-made objects? We intuitively recognize design. We look at it, we can say that certain things are designed. Francis Crick, a devoted evolutionist, stated, "Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved." And he wrote that in 1988. Now, why would he have to say something like that? Well, because biologists look at what they see, the tremendous complexity in life, and they would intuitively say this must be designed. But because some don't like the direction that leads, which is toward an intelligent designer or God, they tell themselves this evolved. But intuitively, they should know that it was not an accident, that it was designed. Well, the teleological argument, or the design argument, depends in part upon the concept of probability. If there is an overwhelming probability against something happening by chance, we assume it was designed by an intelligent agent, and that's perfectly logical. So we ask ourselves, does the universe show evidence of design? Are there things in the universe that have an extremely low probability, I should say almost no probability of ever happening by chance? Well, Let's look at what many people say is originated the universe. Most cosmologists believe in a Big Bang. In his book, A Brief History of Time, which I was able to read recently, Nobel Prize winner Stephen Hawking discussed the Big Bang, which he believed was the point of origin of the universe. He described a universe that started from a tiny point he called a singularity, and all the mass and all the energy in the universe was concentrated in this tiny point. And then it exploded outward in a matter of a fraction of a second. Things started to change and the universe was formed. The one thing I will agree with on the Big Bang, and I'm not a tremendous proponent of the Big Bang theory, but it does acknowledge a beginning, that there's a time when the universe wasn't there. Well, it's telling that in his book, Hawking acknowledged 4 questions he couldn't answer. These are: why was the universe, the early universe, so hot? Why is the universe so uniform on a large scale? So the matter is distributed very evenly around the universe. Why did the universe start out with just the right rate of expansion, which we'll talk about in just a moment? And why does the universe contain irregularities, such as stars and galaxies? Weren't the gases or the atoms, the energy, all dispersed outward and smeared about the universe rather than collecting into stars and galaxies? Well, besides not being able to answer those questions, Hawking also admitted that the cause of the Big Bang was a mystery. In fact, he said we can't look back before the Big Bang. All we can see is whatever happened after the Big Bang began. Well, the Big Bang theory does have many flaws. I read a book recently, too, entitled Dismantling the Big Bang by Alex Williams and John Harnett. And they revealed many scientific flaws in the theory and things that the Big Bang couldn't explain. We've already mentioned, as Stephen Hawking acknowledged some, but they say that it cannot explain star formation. The Big Bang can't explain the formation of galaxies, and it can't explain the rotation in the universe, the rotation of the Earth and the Sun, the galaxies, or even the universe, which apparently they've discovered rotates slowly about some axis. Well, what is the multiverse hypothesis? Many cosmologists are now proposing the multiverse hypothesis as an explanation for the fine-tuning of our universe. They postulate that there are an infinite, or at least a very large number of universes, and that we see the perfect conditions for life in our universe because it's the only one or one of a few that is suitable for life. Well, I think that's just simply begging the question. They're claiming that there are these huge number of universes, and we are just in one of those, but how can we know there are other universes? We have no evidence of any other universes. In fact, it's unproven and it's unprovable that any other universes exist. So they seem to be appealing to a fanciful theory with absolutely no evidence behind it in order to explain fine-tuning. Why not take the obvious answer and say it's finely tuned because we have a very intelligent designer? Well, the Earth is perfectly suited for life. The Earth has lots of water. Water is a necessary component of life, and as we know it, and as far as we can tell, other planets and bodies have very little, if any, water. And water has just the right properties, the right polarity. So one thing about water is when it freezes at a fairly low temperature so that all of the water on the Earth doesn't freeze, it's mostly liquid, and when it freezes, it floats. And that's important because if ice sunk when it froze, there'd be so much ice sinking into the oceans that the oceans would become a block of ice. And it boils at just the right temperature so that it doesn't boil off at normal temperatures and only when it's extremely hot. The Earth is just the right size. It's large enough to attract and hold the atmosphere, but small enough so it's not got a very large gravity. If it was too large, it would crush us with the gravitational attraction. The Earth is spinning at just the right speed. If it were spinning too fast, it would be generating horrendous winds that would make life very unpleasant if at all possible. And if it was spinning too slowly, we'd have heat buildup on one side of the Earth because we'd stay facing the sun too long. And as it is, we're spinning at just the right speed so that it evens out the heat between the day and the night. The Earth's orbit is just the right eccentricity so we don't get too far from the sun nor too close. It's almost a circular orbit. The Earth is tilted at just the right angle. And that causes the seasons. And so that in summer we have more sunlight, in winter we have less sunlight. We have the heavy planets, Jupiter and Saturn, that sit well outside the orbit of the Earth, and they're just ideally located to attract and deflect any incoming bodies, comets or other bodies that might otherwise damage the Earth. And then we've got a moon, and our moon is just the right distance away from the Earth. If it were further away, we wouldn't have tides. The water there in the tidelands along the coast would become stagnant. But if it were much closer, the tides would become, so large they could be, 50, 100 feet high, and that would tend to wipe out everything anywhere along the coast. But they're just right for what we need. And finally, the Earth is located between the spiral arms of the Milky Way galaxy. That's very fortunate because if we were located within one of the spiral arms, there are so many stars and there's such strong radiation that life wouldn't be possible. But we're out in a nice, quiet part of the galaxy away from the spiral arms. So, is the Earth old or is it young? That's a question scientists have debated. And most scientists believe the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. I've asked myself, why didn't they think it was 4.7? But, I don't think they can tell it with that precision. They believe the universe is over 13 billion years old. Now, they do have some evidence. They can tell, as far as the universe is concerned, that the galaxies are very far away. They can measure that with some techniques like triangulation. And they know how far away they are, so they know that light would have taken 13 billion years to get here from there. So given the speed of light, we wouldn't see them if they were created recently and were that far away. They appear to be created a long time ago. Well, some scientists, most of them are Christians, that believe the Earth is only 6,000 years old or so. And they believe it because of a straightforward reading of Genesis chapter 1. But there is a lot of other evidence that the Earth could be very young. And we'll get into a reason why we think that we can explain this. Some Christians do believe in an old Earth. Just as an example, my friend Mike Edenburn, who has been heading up the Science and Faith seminars at the Christian Student Center for the last few years, is a believer in an old Earth. And we had a podcast with Evan where we debated the question of, is the Earth old or young? I still consider him a believer, a fellow Christian, even though we disagree on that point. So I just wanted to make that clear. In fact, I was a believer in an old Earth for quite a time because of this first bullet. I assumed that mainstream science was correct and that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. Well, later on, I learned that I didn't need to believe that there wasn't such good evidence for the age of the Earth, and I am now a believer in a young Earth. But besides that belief, I think old earthers tend to assume that the biblical description is substantially correct, but they reinterpret it to fit the long ages timeline in various ways. One way is through the gap theory, which assumes that billions of years occurred right in the middle of Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. It says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." Then, at the middle of that verse, it says, "And the Spirit of God was moving on the face of the waters." So they believe that God created this, but He didn't really do anything with it for a long period of time. Another theory that old earthers tend to very frequently believe is the long days theory. And I've heard this and was convinced maybe it was correct at one point, but they assume that each of the 6 days in Genesis chapter 1 is a long age of millions or billions of years. Now, the third approach is the allegorical approach, and I think Mike really takes this approach, that says Genesis 1 is a theological description of what God did, of His creative activity, but it's not a historical account, and so it's viewed figuratively, not literally. And could those interpretations of Genesis 1 be valid? Well, it is possible. Personally, I seriously doubt it. One problem with the long days theory is if God created life over a period of several days that were really millions of years long, that means that death and disease came into the world long before the fall of Adam and Eve. And the Bible seems to indicate that that's where death and disease were first introduced. So I think we have some problems with these old earth interpretations, but the folks that believe those are still well-meaning Christians, fellow believers. I want to ask the question, where is the Earth in the universe? Well, most cosmologists believe in a thing called the cosmological principle. They have no reason necessarily to believe it, but they assert it with great emphasis. They say, we cannot assume that the Earth occupies any special place in the universe. They're very adamant about that. But there is evidence that indicates that the Earth is probably near the center of the universe. A PhD physicist from Los Alamos named Russell Humphreys came down and talked to us at Sandia National Labs when I was working there quite a few years ago. He talked about something called quantized redshifts, that we can look at the shift in the light coming from the stars and galaxies, and if it's shifted toward the red, that means they're moving away from us. And what we see, and this was not something he discovered, I think it was Hubble that discovered it, but that the galaxies seem to be moving away from us at the same rate in every direction. And the galaxies seem to be arranged in a set of concentric spheres that surrounds the Earth. If this were the case and the Earth were off-center in an expanding universe, we wouldn't see that same quantized redshifts. And furthermore, evidence shows that the universe is rotating around an axis that is relatively near, in cosmological terms, relatively near the Earth. So there is some evidence that suggests that we are probably near the center of the universe. Why is that important? Well, gravity affects time. How does that happen? Well, Einstein's general theory of relativity states that time is dependent upon gravity. The larger the gravitational force is, the slower time moves. And he predicted that long before we could measure it, but since we've been able to send up satellites orbiting the Earth, we've actually been able to detect that the clocks on the orbiting satellites move slightly slower than clocks on Earth. Well, Russell Humphreys calculated from Einstein's equation that if the Earth is near the center of the universe, and I mean near, maybe several hundred million light years away from the center even, is still near the center. If the universe were somewhat smaller during creation week, maybe a third smaller or half the size it is, which is possible because it is expanding, then the gravitational effects on the Earth were such that millions of years could have elapsed at the edge of the universe while 6 days elapsed on the Earth. Now, Russell Humphreys wrote a book called Starlight and Time, and I got the DVD as well. Looked at that several times. It's very interesting if someone wants to research that further. So we have some evidence that suggests that the universe doesn't have to be any older than the young Earth. But what evidence do we have that suggests a young Earth? Well, the best argument I've heard, because it's understandable by any layman, is that there's very little sediment on the seafloor, very little mud in the seas. And I think Humphreys is the one who got some data from the United States government, Corps of Engineers, or some government agency, that shows how much sediment is flowing down major rivers, like the Mississippi rivers, carrying a certain amount of silt in the water and been depositing that. Well, he calculated that if that silt was being deposited for millions of years, the seas ought to be full of mud. But they're not. And in fact, parts of the sea bottom deep in the ocean are just bare rock. There's no mud at all. We can look at the bent rock layers because rocks tend to be very rigid. You can't bend rock. However, we see many, many layers in the Earth where the rocks, sedimentary rocks, are bent. Well, they probably weren't bent after the fact. What that points to, as far as I'm concerned, and many creationists, is that they were laid down when they were wet. Perhaps as a result of Noah's flood, there were these huge layers of sedimentary rock, and at that point, while they were wet, if the Earth shifted, they could be bent very easily and then hardened later. They've discovered a lot of soft tissue in fossils, dinosaur fossils, up in northern Montana. The researcher there has been leading a team for years, and they've discovered DNA, soft tissue. They've reported cadaverous smells when they're digging the dinosaurs up. All of those things would indicate that the dinosaur fossils are not that old. The Earth has a rapidly decaying magnetic field. It's got an iron core, and scientists think that the circulating iron in the center of the Earth is what causes a magnetic field that extends out into space. But that field is decaying at a certain rate. They can measure that. They can kind of wind the clock back and say, this field could not have been decaying for millions of years. It would be gone by now. So it's fairly recent. They can measure helium. They find helium in some radioactive rocks. Now, helium does not tend to stay in rocks. It's a very small molecule. It's kind of slippery. It tends to work its way out of a rock pretty quickly. And if they find helium in the rocks, that tends to say the rocks are not that old. They find carbon-14 in fossils, dinosaur fossils and other fossils. They find it in coal, and they find it in diamonds. Now, diamonds are pretty stable. They got a very rigid crystalline structure. So any carbon-14 that was in there could not get out. You can't introduce more carbon-14 into a diamond. So carbon-14 decays with a half-life that means it's virtually undetectable, any carbon-14, after about 100,000 years. Well, if we find carbon-14, that says probably these things are not 100,000 years old. They're short-lived comets going around the sun. Their orbits will terminate. I guess maybe they'll crash into the sun before too long. So they couldn't have been orbiting for millions of years. There's very little salt in the sea, just like there's not very much mud. If the rivers had been carrying minerals into the sea for millions of years, they should be very salty, and yet they're not. We find DNA in ancient bacteria, when DNA is supposed to deteriorate fairly rapidly. But why would we find it in bacteria that are claimed to be millions and millions of years old? Well, is science in conflict with God and with the Bible? Is it wrong for us to study the natural world and try to figure out, is it designed, is it a result of God's creation? And I don't see any problem with scientists objectively studying this topic at all. Now, the early scientists were, by and large, believers in God, and they were trying to understand God's creation. So among those are many well-known names, people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Faraday, Maxwell, Kelvin, Boyle, Linnaeus, Mendel, and Pasteur. And all these men made great contributions to science, and they were believers in creation by the God of the Bible. Johann Kepler said something very, very telling. He said, "The chief aim of all investigation of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God." So he entered this scientific endeavor to try to understand God's creation and discover the order and the beauty of it. Well, nowadays, it seems that most scientists of our time feel compelled to explain the existence of the universe and the existence of life without a creator. So they're, I would say, biased in the other direction. If they come across something they can't explain, they typically resort to inventing an explanation, even if it's an implausible one. They invest a lot of effort in building a good story, like the Big Bang or evolution. The evolution is one of the greatest sales jobs in the history of the earth, and we'll talk about that in the next lesson in the Apologetics series. But it's a story to explain things without God. Now, does it hold water? Well, we'll see. I don't think so. But it's not a matter of evidence. It's a matter of developing this narrative to explain the world without God. And what we found out is that scientists who don't pay lip service to the mainstream theories become ostracized pretty quickly. And they're going to have a lot of trouble trying to be recognized and accepted by the scientific community. So there is no conflict, but there seems to be a conflict between those scientists who believe that there is a God, there is a creator, and those who don't believe. Well, why do design arguments persist? People have been making arguments about the beauty and the design of this world and the universe for a long time, and they continue to make those arguments. There was a telling article on the Teleological Argument for God's existence in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and they said, that question is, why do design arguments remain so durable if empirical evidence is inferentially ambiguous? The arguments are logically controversial, and the conclusions vociferously disputed. One possibility is that they really are better arguments than most philosophical critics concede. I would argue that that's exactly the case, that the common man is quite capable of looking at something and seeing the beauty, the evidence of a design, the complexity in objects here in nature. So it is an argument that convinces a lot of people, unless they just don't want to be convinced. Another quote is, design intuitions, however, do not seem to emerge as novel construals from creative grappling with the data, but are embedded in our thinking nearly naturally. So much so that, again, Crick thinks that biologists have to be immunized against it. And I agree. It is a characteristic. It's built into our brains and into our thinking. We can recognize design. And we have to work hard to convince ourselves to the contrary. So we do intuitively recognize design, and God created us to do that, I believe. And that's a powerful testimony to His existence. The fact that we can recognize design, and He created us to do that so that we would know of His existence, His power, His wisdom and might. Now, one other thing I did want to mention, just a little anecdote. I was up on Sandia Crest, up over 10,000 feet on the mountain many years ago with my wife. We were walking around through the woods, and we came across what looked like a single step from a house. That is, it was a rectangular solid. It looked like concrete, nice clean lines, rectangles. My very first thought was, guess what? Who put this here? And I hadn't even been thinking about design arguments or anything else. I was just walking through the woods. Who put this here? Well, I didn't say, well, how did nature create this rectangular solid here on top of the mountain? Did perhaps some flat pieces of slate fall together in just the right shape to build a rectangle? And the rain came, and there was some limestone on the mountain that got mixed in with the sand, and it made a concrete and then hardened. And I didn't think that. I thought, who put this here? And it was a very simple object compared to anything we see in nature. But I knew it was designed. Well, let's look finally at the question, what if people are not convinced by the teleological argument? What if design doesn't convince them of the existence of a designer? Well, I would argue some don't want to be convinced. I think their mind is made up. They've already settled the issue in their minds, and that there is no God. I was talking with a physics PhD student at UNM and mentioned some of the arguments I've already discussed here in this presentation, and he just readily, immediately dismissed them all. He was not convinced by them, and it occurred to me in reflecting on that afterwards, his mind was already made up. It didn't really open his mind to the thought that there might be a God and a designer, and I don't know why. The thought of a creator God can be threatening. Some people, too, think, well, if with all the evil in the world, there must not be a God, because why would He allow that? So they've dismissed a God from that point of view. A God, a creator of this universe, has the authority to set the rules. He has the authority to set limits on our activities. And we human beings don't like limits placed on our activities. So I think a number of people would rather not believe in a God because it gives them the freedom to be their own God, to make their own decisions about right and wrong. The only thing we can do as we talk to people is present the evidence and let them consider it. We can hope that they'll go off and think about it. People generally come to faith in God slowly and not all at once. So it may be, as Evan was mentioning, they talk to us, they may talk to another Christian believer at some point and are presented a different argument. And later on, after being exposed and hearing several different things, perhaps their hearts will open. I think personally that removing the scientific barriers to faith is something that can open their hearts, but they have to be receptive and they have to be seeking. But finally, I think what brings people to faith is a conviction of their own sin and their need for a Savior. I think it's an emotional response as they finally come to faith in Jesus. But by removing some of the barriers, I think that opens a door. And finally, I think the most important thing we can do is share this evidence for God, His existence, His creation, with Christians to help them maintain their faith. I think very often students will go to college and they'll hear professors and other students who are very confident in stating that there is no God and this all could have happened very easily by accident with a Big Bang and the evolution of the different forms of life. And so if they haven't heard anything else, they may say, well, if all of these smart people believe that, it must be so. And by sharing the evidence to the contrary, evidence for the creation of this universe and of the world, I think we can help Christians, especially young believers, maintain their faith. So thank you for listening. Next time we'll be talking about the evidence of design in the biological world. And we'll talk about evolution versus creation. So I'll look forward to that time with you. Thank you.